Finding the gradient of a line.
Completing O-levels at the age of 11 and A-levels at 13. Don't make your kids ordinary. Make them extraordinary. Enroll for a free webinar on Olevels.com now.
Finding the gradient of a line. What exactly is the gradient? The gradient of a line is a measure of how steep a line is. For example, here are a bunch of different lines. We see that this line is the steepest, so it must have the highest gradient. This line, although is steep, it is not as steep as the first line, so it has a lower gradient than the first line. And the third line is the least steep, so it has the lowest gradient. The gradient can be a positive number or a negative number. It can also be 0. If the line grows upwards towards the right, its gradient is positive. For example, if the line is like this, it will have a gradient that is positive. If the line falls downwards towards the right, its gradient is negative. For example, if a line has this direction, or this direction, or this direction, towards the right we see that it is falling downwards. So the gradient must be negative. And finally, if the line is completely flat, the gradient is 0. Now let's look at a few examples. We see that this line is quite steep, and as it moves right, it is increasing. So the gradient of this line must be positive. This line, although not steep as the first line that is, it still increases upwards or grows upwards as we move towards the right. So the gradient of this line also must be positive. Now let's look at this line. This line is falling downwards as we move towards the right. So the gradient of this line must be negative. This line also falls downwards as we move towards the right. So the gradient of this line must also be negative. This line is completely flat. We see that it does not move upwards or downwards as we move towards the right. So the gradient of this line must be 0. And this line, the last line, falls downwards as we move towards the right. So the gradient of this line must be negative. So I hope that makes sense. Now we have a rough idea of what the gradient looks like given a particular direction of the line. But how do we find the exact value of the gradient? Let's do just that by taking the first graph as an example. Now how do we find the exact numerical value of the gradient of this line right here? Well, given any 2 points on a line, x1, y1 and x2, y2, we can find the gradient of the line using this formula. The formula is gradient is equal to y2 minus y1 divided by x2 minus x1. So the formula for the gradient is y2 minus y1 divided by x2 minus x1. What exactly are x1, y1 and x2, y2? Well, they are any 2 points on the line. We can choose any 2 points on the line. So I am going to firstly choose the point minus 9, minus 5, and I'm going to call that x1, y1. Secondly, I am going to choose the point 2, 3, this point right here. So this was the first point I chose, and this is the second point. And using these 2 points, we can then find the gradient. These are the 2 points I chose. So now let's plug in x1, y1, x2, y2 in this formula. x1 was minus 9, y1 was minus 5, x2 was 2, and y2 was 3. So x2 minus x1 becomes 2 minus minus 9, and y2 minus y1 becomes 3 minus minus 5. A minus and a minus make a plus. So both of these 2 minus pairs will become a plus. So 3 plus 5 divided by 2 plus 9. 3 plus 5 is 8 and 2 plus 9 is 11. So this becomes 8 over 11. And the gradient is thus 0.72727272 and an infinite number of 72s. So we can simply round this off to 0.73. So the gradient of this line is 0.73. You should now know how you can find the gradient of a given line. Now you should be able to find the gradient of any one of these lines. Now as an exercise, why don't you try finding the gradient of this line?
Completing O-levels at the age of 11 and A-levels at 13. Don't make your kids ordinary. Make them extraordinary. Enroll for a free webinar on Olevels.com now.